The morning I moved into Riverside, I practiced being smaller. I folded myself into the corner of the passenger seat, hugged the dog-eared copy of Jane Eyre to my chest like a talisman, and repeated a litany of rules I had invented for the new girl. Don't laugh too loud, don't correct people in class, don't treasure any glance that falls on you by accident. The campus lay beyond iron gates like a stage set someone had forgotten to light. Brick buildings rimmed with frost, the bell tower ticking like a metronome. I thought if I kept the cadence slow enough, if I kept my posture neutral, I could disappear into the backdrop and survive the first month. That is, until she walked past the bulletin board. She moved as if she owned the sunlight around her. A long stride, blazer creased in a way that made every seam look intentional. Her hair was blunt at the jaw, dark as a story's end, and there was a narrow, pale line of a scar above her left eyebrow that caught the light and refused to let it go. People made space for her like tidewater making way for a boat. The air shifted when she went by, louder, neater, as if she had assigned a soundtrack to applause. My first thought, the ridiculous private one that felt like an inheritance from all the novels I've read, was that she looked like she could cut a room in half and never apologize. I had come to Riverside with one complicated advantage. I could read places faster than people. The dining hall was divided into islands of etiquette. The theater kids at the long oak table, the swim team aligned like sentinels, the AP Lit circle that attended Ms. Hardwick's class like a flock. Natasha Wilson sat at the head of one of those tables, and when she turned her head, the dining hall rearranged itself to accommodate the angle of her jaw. The first time our paths crossed for real, it was during Ms. Hardwick's AP Lit seminar. I had been rehearsing an answer in my head, the sort of answer that would make the book sing, without sounding like I wanted the book to like me back. When I spoke, my voice folded into the room's air and then, soundlessly, like a gesture, Natasha clapped. It wasn't a generous clap. It was slow and dry, the kind of sarcasm that sets an entire classroom on edge. Heads lifted. A few people smiled. Some rolled their eyes. Ms. Hardwick's mouth tightened in the sort of professional disapproval that reads like a bruise. The sting of red rose up my neck. I wanted to sink into my chair and become part of the upholstery. Instead, my answer felt weirder and truer once it had been measured by her attention. After class, as the student body dispersed, a boy in the back bench tried to rebrand my comment as an affectation, half laughing the sort of laugh that's a finger under an eyebrow. A ripple of quiet followed. Someone made a joke about small talk at the next table. I felt a heat I didn't recognize. Shame, reflexive. And then a shadow dropped across the aisle. "You should keep your head down," Natasha said, mid-conversation, in a tone that suggested she had just offered me a fragile, dangerous gift. It came out like an edict, but it was delivered as if mercy. No one else said anything. Maybe they were relieved she'd spoken. Maybe they were waiting to see what she would do next. My friends, Betty and Lily and Carmen, hadn't arrived yet. I had no one but my own breathing to anchor me. There was a clarity to being singled out that surprised me. Invisibility is a cloak. Notice is a knife. Neither is comfortable, but notice cuts in interesting ways. Natasha's eyes landed on mine for only a second. A precise, appraising look, as if someone were cataloging books and had decided to shelve me under intriguing but unproven. She walked away, leaving the room to its usual chatter. The scar above her brow caught the light and looked like a comma at the climax of a sentence. That afternoon, back in my assigned dorm, I unpacked by routine, books nearest, clothes folded in the way my mother taught me, and wrote a note to Jane Eyre's margin. She who reserves the right to hurt can often keep you under their palm. It felt both melodramatic and true. The campus had a language, I realized. You don't speak to it the way you speak to people. You read it. The next day, Betty, Lily, and Carmen found me in the quad with a thermos and an unreadable expression. Betty hugged me like she could compress my worries into something manageable. Lily put a careful hand on my shoulder the way someone would hold a white tulip, and Carmen's expression was all blunt practicality. "You're high on being mysterious," Betty said, grinning. Don't let her snark get to you. Natasha Wilson? Lily's voice was softer. She's complicated. Complicated is what people say when they mean dangerous, Carmen said. She's got a history. Don't be in it. They each told me a version of the same thing, which is how rumors become sacred text. In one story, Natasha ruined a girl's scholarship with a smear campaign. In another, she had broken someone's wrist in a fight, and then smoothed things over so the administration could deny it. In every version, she was both queen and executioner. But in all versions, the scar above her brow was a necessary flourish. They say it taught her to draw blood without staining her hands. She'll come for you if you look like you're worth the trouble, Betty said, shrugging as if she were offering me inventory management advice. She doesn't tolerate those who are pretending. I listened, took notes in the margins of my own face, how I was breathing, whether my hands betrayed me, and then, in the evening, my mother called. Jane Charles had a no-nonsense voicemail. Her voice was pragmatic but soft. Keep friends, she said. Don't assume power will protect you, and if anyone scares you, text me. No shame, no drama. Her last line was what surprised me most. But also, if you meet someone interesting, don't let fear arrange the furniture for you. You can still be curious. Curiosity. I wrote the word down because it felt like a map. I had not come to Riverside for safety. I had come because I needed to be remade by a place whose rules were strict enough to force me into shape. I hadn't expected the remaking to be a person. A week of small tests followed. They were not dramatic. They happened like revisions, erased lines and rewritten margins. Natasha and I crossed paths in the chemistry lab. I had always liked the lab's glass geometry, beakers and tubes, the way light refracted through solutions, how a compound could change color like mood. On a Tuesday, with the late sun making the room glitter, a beaker at the next station tipped. Someone's elbow, a careless reach, sent a hot salt solution sloshing toward my lab notebook. I moved too slow to protect paper, too fast to be graceful. The solution seared a dark halo into the corner of my notes. Heat crawled under my fingernails like an accusation. Laughter rose, small and sharp. You should be more careful, Jane Eyre. A senior called the sort of thing that lands like a soft pebble and ricochets. Natasha's hand closed on the bench beside my elbow before anyone else could decide what to do. She didn't help me pick up papers, didn't offer sanitizer like a good Samaritan. She blocked the liar's line with her body. Watch your hands, she said, not loud but precise. Her voice had no performative sweetness. She tilted her head, and those around her felt the point of observation and shrank. She moved to fetch clean distilled water and, with a flat absence of warmth, steadied my shaking hands while I rinsed my burned knuckles. Her fingers were cool. She held no pity. When she handed me a stack of napkins, she looked at the ruined corner of my notebook and said, "Don't let one spill be the story." It sounded like an order and like a kindness at the same time. On the way out, someone made a cursory joke about friends strong-arming first years for sport. Natasha's eyes cut to them, sharp and for a moment unreadable. Then she shrugged as if the joke were too small to punish. She didn't laugh with them. She didn't need to. The protection was a thing observed, like a rule changing in the syllabus midterm. That small rescue announced me in a way I had not accounted for. It was not the kind of rescue that makes you a heroine. It was a pragmatic intervention, a blocking hand that spelled a new perimeter around me. People noticed. Whispers grew like mold along the dorm corridors. She helped her. She stopped them. And with the whispering came an invisible routing. My name shifted from anonymous files to a bookmarked page on someone else's shelf. I could have taken it as gratitude, or I could have taken it as a warning. I promised myself to treat it as evidence, and kept my behavior neutral. There were other small incidents that shifted the atmosphere. A poster on the student board declared an upcoming production. Upon it, someone had stuck a tiny yellow post-it that read, "Queen of Everything," under Natasha's photo, the handwriting deliberate and childish. I found myself tracing that post-it later on a late-night walk, my fingers following the loop of the cue like a ritual. It felt foolish to be invested in the way other people described her. But there is a particular hunger in being seen, even when seen through the lens of someone else's trophy. One afternoon, as dusk folded the quad into a watercolor of lamplight and cold, I sat on the dorm porch with my book, the pages whispering like a companion. Lily found me and sat across, folding her knees into her arms the way a poet tucks her words into a single breath. She read the moment carefully, and then started to unpack the rumors again. Less gossip, more concern. Power doesn't soften for no reason, Lily said. If she protects you, it's not necessarily because she's decided you're a friend. Maybe you represent something she wants to keep for herself. What, like a trophy? I asked, half amused, half brittle. No, Lily said. Like something not worth sharing. People like that make rules the rest of us have to learn. You have to decide if you want to live by them. That evening I sat on my bed in the dim glow of a desk lamp and tried to chart my feelings like a ledger. Curiosity counted for one, fear and self-preservation for another. There was also the peculiar small warmth that sprang when someone who could have stepped on you instead stepped in. I didn't like how that warmth felt treacherous, like it was betraying the self I had vowed to protect. Was I learning to conflate attention with affection? Campus life learns quickly what to do with anomalies. People will file you into categories if you let them. I wanted to avoid classification, so I made a choice I thought would preserve my agency. I began to ask questions. Not flattery, not confession, but small, measured queries. I asked Natasha once, at the edge of a rehearsal she was overseeing in the Black Box Theater, what play they were staging. She answered with a clipped description and a look that held as a test and an offering. "It's a revival. We're making it sharp," she said. "You're welcome to watch if you promise not to fall asleep." We fell into an odd rhythm, small collisions that felt choreographed, a remark exchanged in the hallway, a glance over a staged confrontation in drama club, the way she made room for me to stand near the back of the black box when she was rehearsing lines. She never invited me in the warm way other leaders do. Her invitations were taut strings, as if she were testing how I might pull. Then, the coffee shop. It was supposed to be nothing, a study group between classes, the sort of thin social obligation that campus life requires. We met at the student-run coffee house, where the espresso machine breathed like an anxious animal, and the chairs were mismatched like a thrift store for the chronically tired. I sat with a paper and a pen, pretending my notes were the most urgent thing on earth. Natasha arrived late, all angles and purpose. She skirted to a table near mine, and, with a deliberate movement that might have been clumsy, or might have been planned, her hand swept a cup and sent dark liquid like a spill of ink arching across the table toward me. Time slowed, not for the melodrama, but for the possibility. It could be an accident, a test, or a stunt. The cup hit the edge, sloshed, and coffee spread in a fan toward my notebook. The barista gasped, teenage theatrics, with others looking up as if the coffee had announced breaking news. Natasha's hand was on mine before reflex could do anything else. Not snatching, not a dramatic move to claim ownership, but placed over my fingers, and there was a steadiness that stopped me from flinching. She dabbed at the spill with a napkin, not with fanfare, but with method. There was a tenderness to the way she wiped that astonished me, and the angle of her mouth when she said, "You could be more careful," carried a statement, and an apology coiled in the same breath. Later, when I thought about it, I couldn't decide whether the spill was accident or performance. I told myself it didn't matter much. Actions have consequences regardless of intent. The consequence here was that she had, in a public place, made room for me to be attended to, and by doing so, had made me more visible. A friend could point to the pattern and say, "See, she intrudes and then rescues. It reads like possession disguised as protection." I saw that too, the way protectiveness often has teeth. But looking back, there was also a hesitancy in her face that I had not noticed earlier, a fraction of slack in the jaw. The same hesitation when she had not joined in that mean joke in chemistry lab. Perhaps my presence had altered the script by shifting her toward something like care. Perhaps I wanted to believe that. Word of the coffee incident spread. People murmured again, picking over the event like students picking crumbs from a lecture hall floor. Some called it cute, some called it manipulative, some were simply fascinated that the queen had paused to wipe another's napkin. The next morning, a note was pinned to the bulletin board beneath a printed campus photo. Someone had scrawled, with that same childish bravado, "She makes her little pets." It was crude and unfair. I stared at it, felt my face grow hot, and then looked up to see Natasha standing across the quad, as if she had materialized to draw a line. She walked to the board, steadied the paper, and then, this is the part that still startles me when I recall it, removed the sticky note with a single, clean motion. She didn't crumple it or throw it away. She folded it and stuck it into the pocket of her blazer like a private thing. No flourish, no announcement. The action was small, exact, and utterly hers. Later that day, in a hallway that smelled faintly of bleach and old books, she intercepted me. The corridor was a gauntlet where eyes pricked curiosity and gossip. For a second, I thought she would spit some scorn, a test perhaps. Instead, she said, with a tone that skittered between command and confession, "You're off limits." The words fell like a bell. There are protections named in law, and protections named in possessiveness. I felt both in that phrase. She paused, like someone considering the shape of a promise, then added, quieter, "Try not to make me hate you." There are sentences that rearrange your internal furniture. In an instant, I had the ridiculous image of the two of us standing on a stage, each holding a prop labeled danger and delight. The line, "Try not to make me hate you," was a map of territories, warning, pleading, a note of fear hidden inside a threat. It pinned me to a new kind of reality. In her mouth, the words were both a request and an ultimatum. They meant that she recognized I had agency, that I could, by my actions, tilt her feelings from protectiveness toward something darker. She was saying she would try to shield me, and she feared the cost. I could have answered with flippant defiance. I could have told her that I did not want to be claimed, or that I would not be a pawn. Instead, I said nothing. The truth felt complicated enough without adding rhetoric. My silence was not submission. It was a purchase of time. Everything after that moment felt like a trial run of intimacy. A look that lingered too long. A guarded smile. The awkwardness of not knowing how to reciprocate attention from a person who had once been a threat. I found myself cataloging small changes. How she would step between a mocking remark and its target. How she sometimes lingered to ask if I wanted a ride to the library. How the curve of her mouth softened at the edges when she thought I wasn't looking. Those were not full transformations. They were small, cautious alterations, as if someone had paused a habitual motion and substituted another. My friends watched the new pattern with the acute skepticism of people who have seen power behave poorly before. Betty's grin turned too tight when I told her the story. "You're playing with fire," she said, blunt and practical. "This is not a redemption arc. It's a dangerous adjacency." Lily, always the one to translate feeling into art, said, "She is a character in your story already. Be wary of allowing fiction to write your life." Carmen, who had the sharpest survival instincts among us, leaned forward like a coach. "You set rules," she said. "If she violates them, you leave. You don't let a scarf of protection tie you to a ship that's sinking." I listened to them, and I listened to my mother, Jane, who sent me late texts that were half motherly micromanagement and half empathy. "Remember to sleep. Eat something that isn't instant noodles. Don't let anyone rearrange your world without your say." I did try to set rules. I told Natasha once, when her hand brushed mine by accident in the black box, that I did not like surprises without consent. She looked at me, close enough that the freckles along my nose were visible, and an odd thing happened. Her expression flickered. Irritation, amusement, respect. Then she nodded. "Fair," she said. "I like to do things on my terms, but I can try to be less theatrical." That the push for consent came from me mattered. It placed the power of negotiation in my hands, which is perhaps the narrowest victory in a power imbalance, but still a victory. I was not simply a character being moved by her plot. I was asking for stage directions. There were still lines she crossed. She would occasionally allow a joke at my expense, and sometimes the edge of her sarcasm was sharp enough to cut. Once, at a theater rehearsal, she directed an aside meant to sting me, and the audience laughed in a way that stung like salt. I did not forgive her immediately. I called attention to it, not publicly, but in words that were small and precise. "That was unnecessary," I said later. She didn't apologize with flourish. She tightened her jaw and said, "Noted." A flat apology is not a bomb, but it acknowledges a breach, and an acknowledgement is a place to begin repair. Natasha's ambiguity was the thing that kept me awake at night. Was she trying to protect me because I had appealed to some loose code of hers? A code that made possession a form of care? Or was I the one who had started to change her scripts? Sometimes I imagined her sitting alone in the theater after everyone had left. The house lights up like a constellation, and thought she might be looking over the day's rehearsals and deciding whether to keep a line or cut it. I liked thinking my presence could prompt that second guessing. I liked thinking my curiosity might be the lever that nudged her. Once, when we were alone in the practice room, she said, almost apologetically, "You're interesting." The word landed like a soft coin tossed on a wooden table. It felt like a theft of sorts, someone stealing the private part of me and announcing its value. Interesting is not the same as in love, and not the same as friend, and not the same as threat. It was an inventory entry. After she said it, she added, with that edge of ownership again, "But keep in mind, if you cross me, I will not be kind." There is an old grammar for such sentences. They read like contracts. The phrasing contained a truth. She could offer a degree of shelter, but shelter came at a price. The price, in her vocabulary, included a capacity for pain. That was the cliff I found myself edging toward. A relationship whose first currency was protection extracted through intimidation. I had to decide if curiosity could sit next to that fact without being complicit. Agency, I reminded myself, is not just about leaving. It's about choosing and setting the terms. The last week of classes before the break brought a small crisis that rewired the social circuitry in tiny, meaningful ways. An upperclassman, someone who relished the role of campus gossip, started a rumor that I had been given special privileges in the theater because I was Natasha's new project. The rumor infected a rehearsal, and the director, exhausted and needing someone to blame, pulled me aside to ask for clarity. My hands trembled. My throat felt armored with old defenses. I expected Natasha to respond with performative anger, the kind that terrifies more than consoles. Instead, she stepped into the director's office, leaned against the doorframe like a punctuation, and said quietly, "She's a student. She works like everyone else." Her words were a shield, but there was also that hesitation. She didn't deliver it as a decree so much as a line of defense. She could have demolished the rumor completely. She opted instead to be precise, to correct without spectacle. The director's scowl eased. The rumor was not stomped into oblivion, but it was defanged. Later, when I thanked her, she shrugged as if it were the least dramatic thing in the world. "Don't make me have to fight for you publicly," she said, with a small, near-embarrassed laugh. "It looks unladylike." Then softer, "Try not to make me hate you." In that laugh and that softness I caught something like possibility. Not redemption. Far from it. But a fissure where a different script might one day fit. Maybe it was my presence that had pried open that tiny crack. maybe it was random. The truth is, I did not yet have the evidence to say which. I had only the experience of being shielded and the responsibility to use my agency to define what I wanted from that shield. I went home for a weekend to reset, and my mother noticed the change right away. Jane Charles is not sentimental. She is the kind of person who measures love by practicalities. Did you lock your car? Did you eat? And so when she asked, "Are you in any trouble?" I laughed and told her everything with an odd economy of detail. She listened, and at the end she said, "If she is a threat, you leave. If she is a friend, you test the friendship. And if she is something in between, you decide what you will tolerate." "How do I know?" I asked. "You won't," she said plainly. "You only know by being in it, and by paying attention to what you turn into while you're there. Don't allow yourself to become smaller to be kept. Don't be made into a talisman to stop someone's loneliness." Her words hovered like an instruction manual for selfhood. I folded them into my bag along with Jane Eyre and returned to Riverside with a new list. Boundaries, sleep, rules to leave. I had to keep them visible. When I returned, their worlds had continued without me. The scar above Natasha's brow caught light in the same way as before. She greeted me in the hallway with something close to a smirk and a question I wasn't expecting. "Did you miss anything?" I thought for a moment. "The bell tower," I said, "and the smell of the theater curtains." She smiled briefly, like a curtain being pulled. "Good. Then you noticed the right things." That evening, I wandered into the black box to watch a rehearsal. She was there, directing, authoritative, and taut. I sat in the dark, my attention a small lamp. At one point, she called for a break and came to where I sat. We stood close enough that the air between us felt like fabric. She looked at me, then at the stage, then back at me with a startling frankness. "You're different than I expected," she said. Her voice dropped. "Don't ruin it." "That's an odd request," I murmured. "It is," she agreed. "But it's also true. I don't like wasting things I care about." She said it like a warning and like a confession. The words tied my curiosity to a threat and to a care so entangled I couldn't easily decide whether to be flattered or alarmed. At that moment, the theater felt less like a stage and more like an apparatus for consequence. The audience, the performers, the director, all roles shifting with a glance. I realized that our interactions were a kind of rehearsal for something bigger, and that whatever came next would challenge both of us. She had placed me under a kind of protection whose boundaries were ambiguous and whose penalties were implied. She had also, in small increments, begun to change. She stepped in where she might previously have stepped over me. She erased sticky notes with a casual decisiveness. She stopped a joke from landing with a laugh. She had said, softly and jaggedly, that I was off limits, and in that act, she had done something for which there would be consequences to pay. I fell asleep that night with the book at my chest, the characters in their own fights and reconciliations, and I felt a shift inside me that was both terrifying and intoxicating. To be seen by someone who knows how to bruise you is not a neutral thing. Attention from a person like Natasha rearranged the camp map of my life. Allies moved, enemies recalibrated, and somewhere inside me a new thread began to pull. Part curiosity, part dread, part the stubborn wish that maybe a person could change without trauma being their middle name. I had every intention of keeping my independence intact. I had vowed not to be swept into the orbit of someone who afforded protection like a poet of bruises. Yet the truth is that she had started to change her patterns because I was there. The changes were small. She hesitated more often before mocking, stepped in when rumors grew teeth, and, most dangerous of all, let herself show a sliver of concern that wasn't performative. Whether that sliver would expand, fracture, or harden remained to be seen. That was the precipice I stood upon, feeling for the purchase of my agency while acknowledging my attraction, reading the faint sign of alteration in someone who had been a storm. The story was not neat. It was not safe. It was, in the most dangerous and honest way, beginning. When the week unspooled into the rhythm of classes and rehearsal, Natasha's small reversals settled in like unexpected annotations in a margin I had thought closed. She arrived earlier to rehearsal, not to dominate the space, but to stand in the wings and watch actors warm. She would pause when someone laughed at another's mistake, and sometimes, bafflingly, look away, as if refusing to provide the expected fuel. Little bends in her behavior registered for me like a punctuation, subtle but meaningful. I began to catalog them not as proof of redemption, but as evidence of a crack, and a crack is only the first thing light looks for. One evening, the theater was humid with the smell of dust and stage polish. Paperbacks and scripts lay like a town of folded houses on the director's table. The cast moved through a scene that required close, competitive banter. It was a choreography of bruises and reconciliations. Halfway through, Janelle, the actress who liked the easy laugh of cruelty, tossed a line that landed at my expense, an aside about new girls being shiny and naive. The room tittered. I felt the habitual spike, anger folding into the spine, the old reflex to shrink. Before I could decide what to do, Natasha cut off the laughter with a look so direct, it sounded like a spoken syllable. She didn't announce a rebuke. She simply redirected the scene, called for a rework, and made it clear that anyone who used humiliation as a beat would be reblocked. It was not a speech. It was a change of choreography that left no space for mockery. After rehearsal, Janelle made a careless joke at my expense in a corridor still half wet with stage light. I kept moving. The corridor ended at the dressing rooms, a narrow passage where whispers could become decisions. Natasha appeared in the doorway, silhouetted like a bookend. Janelle's voice faltered. "Don't," Natasha said. It was a small word. The power of it was something else. Janelle stumbled into an apology that read like a tepid curtain call. I heard the rumor rippling again the next day. Someone had overheard. Someone who told someone else. And the rumor made the rounds. But the energy of it had shifted. The rumor left prints, but the prints no longer led where they had in the past. That night, Lily met me by the practice room with a thermos and a look like a question mark. "You're halfway to thinking she's a hero," she observed. "Only halfway," I corrected. "Heroes don't fold sticky notes into their pockets." "She folded it like she planned to remember," Lily said. "I think remembering is harder than performing cruelty. At least it's a different muscle." There was a strain in my chest that had nothing to do with theater. I wanted to believe in possibility because possibility felt like oxygen after the choke of anonymity. But I had sworn to keep rules, my own contract of survival, and the test would be whether I enforced them. A week later, I had an occasion to do just that. We were in the student center after a late rehearsal, the fluorescent lights making everyone look too honest. Someone from the swim team, TJ, who had been one of the quieter abusers of wit, started a thread of gossip about the folded sticky note, calling it cute, and suggesting that Natasha kept trophies. Laughter started thin and brittle. I felt my skin heat. I could have stepped back and let it go. That was always the easier route. But there was a ledger forming inside me that said certain behaviors were non-negotiable. Someone needed to say that humiliating another human being for sport was not clever. It was cruelty. I stood, not to make a scene but to assert a boundary. "That's enough," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. Conversation paused like a train with its doors open. People turned. Natasha's face, in the light of the student center, looked like a map you had to look long at before reading. Basins, ridgelines, a small pale scar that caught light like punctuation. TJ laughed a little, uncomprehending. "Oh, come on. We're having fun." "It's not fun for the person being talked about," I said. "It doesn't make you clever. It isolates someone. We can be better than pet names and sticky note trophies." There was a silence that tasted like snow. Natasha's jaw tightened. For a dark second, I braced for a retort that would make me regret my audacity. Instead, she stood up. "She's right," she said. The words landed like a threshold unlocked. People shifted uncomfortably, some smoothing their expressions into something more palatable. "What?" TJ began. "Cut it," Natasha said. Her voice had a new tone, less theatrical, more practical. "If you want to gossip, take it somewhere else. It makes everyone look small." The room deflated. Jokes died in the air like balloons pierced. Natasha was not loud in her correction. She simply refused to indulge the cruelty. Later, as everyone filed out, someone muttered that she'd only done it to look magnanimous. Someone else said she had saved me on purpose. Both things could be true without canceling the other. When the crowd thinned, she walked me across the empty center, the vending machines glowing like small altars behind us. I could see the careful measuring of her emotions in the way she held her hands. "You didn't have to do that," I said, partly curious, partly cautious. "Probably," she admitted. "But I wanted to. It was tedious watching you stand there and let them act like that." There it was again. Something that felt like protection without a performative edge. It folded into a softer, quieter territory. I wanted to press the moment, ask whether she would do it always, whether her intervention was a new habit or an exception. Instead, I asked a different question. Why me? Why not just call them out for everyone else? Her look was honest and complicated. Because you don't belong to any of their factions. You're not a project or a rival. You're you. It's annoying to see people hurt someone when it isn't necessary. Her answer was a kind of care, raw and not particularly flattering. It did not absolve her past, nor did it explain all her contradictions. It did, however, feel like a step away from cruelty being her first instinct. It felt like a small pivot. I thanked her, and she shrugged as if the day had been long, and this was the smallest of inconveniences. Then she surprised me by adding, "Don't think this means I won't call you out when you screw up." "I wouldn't want it any other way," I said, meaning it. That weekend I kept my rules. I slept. I ate with intention. I texted my mother more often than I usually would, partly to appease the thin voice of worry, and partly to keep myself anchored. Jane's answers were plain and practical. Good. Keep your head. Don't tolerate being toyed with. She asked what I was doing with Natasha, and I could only tell her that the person was changing in small increments. Jane's reply was straightforward. Small increments are still direction. Keep your boundaries. Boundaries proved their weight sooner than I expected. 2 weeks later, during a late rehearsal where the cast was experimenting with a scene of moral ambiguity, Natasha misread a beat and made a cruel aside directed at me. The audience, just the cast and a few people, laughed in the way people laugh when they're surprised by a small cruelty. I felt that old trickle of hot shame, the reflex to tuck myself into smallness. But this time, there was another reflex too, the need to name the thing and refuse to normalize it. After rehearsal, I caught up with her in the hallway, the air smelling of coffee and dust. "That wasn't funny," I said, simple and steady. She turned, and for a second I saw a flash of old habit, the smile that sharpened into something thin. "It was an observation," she countered. "It hurt," I said. "It's not a theater beat. It's a comment on my character, and you don't get to make that in my absence." Her face shifted in ways that often announced moderation. The jaw tightened, then relaxed. "I was trying to be honest," she said. "I thought—" "You thought what?" I asked. "That you could say whatever you wanted because you have power here?" "I thought it would sharpen the scene," she admitted, in a voice that didn't justify. Maybe I was wrong. That admission mattered. It wasn't dramatic contrition. It was a small, precise acknowledgement. She looked at me, and I saw the sliver of doubt that had been growing. Not from me, but perhaps reflexively from being watched by me in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was almost as if my refusal to be a passive piece of her spectacle had unsettled her script. "I don't want to be the person who hurts people," she said, low. "Not always. Not when it isn't necessary." Her words should have been a relief. Instead, they were a wound wrapped in gauze. Better than no apology, but not a cure. I felt myself at a moral crossroad. Agency meant I could accept small change and see if it widened, or I could demand more, to press for accountability beyond the theater door. I chose the smaller test. Insistence on clarity. "Then don't use me for the scene," I said. "If a line is meant to test your character, say it as your character, not as a way to make me blush or shrink." She blinked. "Fair," she said. And there was that odd concession again, like a ruler reteaching itself to draw straight. We tried a rehearsal of the scene where the characters traded accusations. This time, she let the edge live in the words without turning it in on me. It felt like practicing a new muscle. I could see her relearning, not by sermon, but by doing. That night, as we walked out into the empty quad, the sky loomed like wet ink. A group of students were clustered near the bell tower, faces half-lit and full of rapid, private judgments. Someone shouted a name, Natasha's, and the group turned like a single organism. I braced, half expecting a show. Instead, Natasha stepped forward. "Not tonight," she said. "Not a command, but a closure. If you want to talk, do it politely." The students laughed nervously and drifted away, the shape of power rearranged by a refusal. I was learning the difference between spectacle and boundary. Her interventions were less theatrical. They were more like a gate being closed, practical and final. They didn't make her less formidable. They made her less performatively cruel, and that distinction mattered. Still, change is not a straight line. 2 days later, the world served my hesitation in the form of a photograph. Someone had taken a picture at a party. Natasha, holding court, with a drink in hand, and a face that could be read as both amused and calculating. Beside her, the girl who'd once been the target of her rumor smearing smiled like someone who'd survived and learned to love the honey of social belonging again. The caption was cruel in its economy. Aristocrats of meanness. It spread like a stain. Messages piled up. Someone clipped it and pinned it to the student board with a flourish of malice. When I saw it, my heart sank. Old scripts have longer tails than we expect. The photo made it seem as if nothing had changed. I could have interpreted it as evidence that the castle of small improvements was a facade. I could have let it convince me to shutter the curiosity that had become both a weapon and a liability. Instead, I went to the board. There was a bunch of students gathered, gossip-fueled and eager. Natasha was there too, and for a moment I braced for spectacle. She looked at the pinned photograph with a short, private expression. Then with her hand, she smoothed the picture's corner as if closing a wound. She peeled the pin out and folded the photograph into her palm. A small, private movement, but this time she did not keep it tucked away in a blazer pocket. She handed it to me. "I don't want that pinned up," she said. The voice had an edge of exhaustion. "If people want to talk about the past, they can talk to me. But don't let a picture decide what you are." I took the photo. Its weight felt like an accusation and a test. "You're asking me to defend you," I said. "You know that's risky." "I know," she said. "And I'm asking because I don't want an image to be the story. You can choose what you do with it, but don't let their noise determine your choice." It was then that I understood a new configuration. Natasha was not asking me to be her shield blindly. She was asking me to decide whether I would be involved as my own agent. She was extending an invitation to participate in a rearrangement, but not offering a carte blanche. That was the change she had begun to make, inviting accountability without staging it as performance. I could have refused. I could have gone to the administration and demanded an investigation, insisted on public rebuke. Some friends argued that's what I should do. Betty was blunt. "Don't hand her a life jacket and expect it to be free from holes." Carmen offered a pragmatic assessment. You don't owe anyone your risks, but agency felt like a ledger I had to keep open. I decided to meet her halfway. I'll talk, I said. But not because you ask, because I want to see if what you say matches what you do. She nodded. Fair, she said. And if I fail, leave. I won't stop you. The conversation with the dean was formal, curt, and unsentimental. Natasha sat beside me in the office like an accomplice in a public proceeding. Not dominating, not submissive, but present. She answered questions that required clarity, about past incidents, about her involvement, about the culture she had cultivated. She didn't minimize. She didn't confess in dramatic flourishes. She answered with a precision that suggested someone practicing a vocabulary of accountability. The dean took notes, asked for a plan of conduct. Natasha agreed to a mediated meeting, and she volunteered to apologize where she had been able to identify harm. The dean looked surprised, but the surprise did not absolve her. Consequences were coupling themselves to attempts at change. After the meeting, outside the office, I felt a tide of relief wash through me. Not because everything had been fixed, but because the ledger was moving in a direction that acknowledged harm and requested repair. Natasha's willingness to engage with the dean was not redemption. It was a first, imperfect step. Thank you, I said to her. Not because I wanted to be placatory, but because I believed the action mattered. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw the fatigue of someone who had been used to performing control. Don't thank me for doing what I should have done sooner, she said. But thank you for staying involved. That counts. Staying involved counted. I realized then that my presence had begun to alter the list of options available to her. I was not a miracle. I was not a savior. I was a witness, an engaged participant who refused to be a prop. The next weeks were a series of small tests. There were moments when Natasha relapsed into sharpness, old jokes that tasted of ownership, a sarcastic observation thrown in to keep an audience entertained. Each time I called it out. Sometimes she apologized directly. Sometimes she said noted and worked it out later. Each time the pattern showed that her responses were changing, from reflexive defense to an effort to repair. She took on a counseling session offered by the school, and I watched her sit through it with hands clenched in her lap. Vulnerability looked awkward on her. It was not pretty. It was work. The moments that mattered most were the private ones. In the dim quiet of the black box after a late rehearsal, she found me folding pages of Jane Eyre, as if the book and its margins were a map I needed to read. Up close, the scar above her brow looked softer, a line that had softened with time. You read that book a lot, she observed. It's part ritual, I said, and part protection. She sat across from me on a stack of stage props, the lights making a warm pool around us. You keep me honest, she said. I laughed softly, more surprised than amused. Do I? You make me think about the consequences of my jokes, she said. You make me consider making a change for reasons other than image. That's not a small thing, I said. But it's also not everything. We were both careful. There was a line we both recognized, a line between gratitude and ownership, between care and coercion. One night, as we stood alone in the wings, she reached for my hand in a gesture that was both question and request. It was a small movement, gentle enough to be consensual, and I did not recoil. I did, however, stop it before it crossed into something I wasn't willing to name yet. Not tonight, I said, gently withdrawing and looking at her face. I want honesty before intimacy. She nodded, and there was no argument. Fair, she said. I don't like being told no, but I like being told the truth more. That line, truth before intimacy, became part of our vocabulary. It was not passionate. It was boring and important. It grounded the relationship in consent and deliberate choice rather than reflex or possession. But life does not yield to tidy rules. A confrontation waited at the edge of the semester that threatened to test everything we'd redefined. Someone leaked an edited audio, snippets from a rehearsal where Natasha's tone had been harsh and mocking, compiled into a montage that made her sound like a caricature of cruelty. It was posted anonymously, and people took it as gospel. Administrators asked for a statement. Students called for a campus forum. Natasha's old alliances recoiled or rallied depending on their interest. She called me that night, her voice stripped of the armor she usually wore. "They're calling a forum," she said. "They want me to speak. I could drown this out with charisma, but She stopped. "I don't want to. I want to try to be accountable in a way that doesn't look like performance." "You could refuse to go on spectacle," I said. "You could propose something else." "I might," she said. "But I also need to be willing to take whatever comes. I need to show I'm not just performing. I need you, if you are willing, to be there. Not as my defender, but as someone who knows what I do when I'm trying." It was an odd request. She was asking me to testify to the truth of her efforts, without coercing me to shield her. It was a test not only for her, but for me. If I stood with her, would people see me as complicit? Would I be betraying my own rules? I thought of my mother's guidelines and the ledger of agency I'd been balancing. "I'll come," I said, "but I won't make myself small for you. I'll speak honestly about what I see." "Thank you," she said. It sounded like relief and risk braided together. The forum was a cramped auditorium, the lights too bright and honest. Students sat in rows like a jury. The administration sat on the stage like a careful jury. Natasha stood at the podium first, and for a heartbeat I thought she might perform, a speech polished and fierce. Instead, she spoke with a precision that was surprising. She acknowledged harm. She named specific behaviors. She apologized without theatrical flourish. She said she'd seek counseling, that she'd agree to restorative circles where appropriate, that she would accept consequences the administration saw fit. It was not a dramatic confession. It was a ledger entry, honest and thin. When it came time for public comment, people lined up with grievances and support, with anger and with confusion. I listened to voices that had been hurt, and to voices that had always been blinded by admiration. When I stood up to speak, I knew that my words would not exonerate her. I knew they would not erase past pain. But I also knew that signs of change mattered when they were accompanied by accountability. "I want to say I have seen small changes," I began. The sentence felt like a careful step. "I have been on the receiving end of both her cruelty and her protection. That doesn't cancel one another out. What matters now is whether the person in front of you is willing to do the work. I have seen her do that work in public and in private. That doesn't mean I forgive everything, but it means I believe there is a possibility to be held to account and still be allowed to try." My words landed with mixed reception. Some students applauded, others muttered. The point was not to make a crowd love her. The point was to assert a nuance that rarely thrives in scandal culture. People can be both harmful and capable of change, and both must be held true. When the forum ended, Natasha found me behind the stage, the corridor smelling like reheated coffee. She looked raw. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I did," I said. "Because I think it's important you be held to this new standard and not condemned to your past entirely." She folded in on herself like someone measuring the cost. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Not of consequences, of doing the wrong thing when I meant well. I don't always know where the line is." "Then learn it," I said. "And when you cross it, repair. That's the rule." She laughed, a small, half-terrified sound. "That's harder than it sounds." "Everything worth changing is," I said. We stood in silence for a long moment. Then, startlingly, she reached out and pressed her palm to the scar above her brow, an unconscious gesture that read like both barrier and memory. "You're not mine," she whispered, the words more to herself than to me. But I don't want to be the person who destroys you. I want to be someone who protects in a way that doesn't cost you pieces of yourself. The confession was hardly grand. It was not a vow. It was both raw and fragile. I felt the tug of something inside me that had been reconfigured by proximity. A hope that small changes might be scaffolded into more structural ones, and a fear that power's old habit would reclaim its throne. The semester ended on a note of uneasy truce. People claimed victories and losses depending on their angle. Policies were amended, restorative circles scheduled. Natasha complied with requirements, grumbling sometimes, cooperative at others. The folded sticky note stayed in her pocket. Now, I noticed, with a crease softened by many handling. She had not replaced it with theatrical displays. She kept it private, like a map she consulted in solitude. On the last night before winter break, as the campus sank into a hush of cold and lamplight, Natasha found me by the bell tower. The wind made our hair speak in soft gusts. She looked at me, unguarded for once. "I've been trying," she said. "Some of it is clumsy, some of it looks performative, I know, but it's not all that. I don't want to be the woman people remember for taking. I want to be someone who can learn to give better." "You mean to give protection without claiming?" I said. "Exactly," she replied. "And to accept when protection isn't welcome." Her answer was both a promise and an unfinished sentence. "I don't know if I can fully change," she added, honest and small. "But having you watch is different. It makes me not want to be the worst version of myself." There it was, an admission that my presence altered the shape of her decisions. It could have been flattering. Instead, it felt like a responsibility. If my curiosity had been the lever that nudged her, then there were ethical weight and cost wrapped with the possibility. Change was no longer a romantic notion. It was work that might require me to intervene, to witness, and sometimes to withdraw. Before I left for home, she did something that surprised even me. She reached into her blazer and took out a tiny, folded square, the yellow post-it she'd once removed from the bulletin board. She handed it to me, the paper creased and worn. "I thought you should have it," she said, "not as a trophy but as a reminder of how things started, of how small things can change." I took the square. It felt like both a relic and an instruction manual. "I'll keep it in my book," I said, "but I'll also keep my rules." "Keep them," she said, "and if I break them, leave." "I will," I promised. We said nothing else then, because there was no elegant punctuation to offer. We stood in the cold and let our breath join the fog, two people whose maps overlapped in dangerous but promising ways. As I drove home the next day, the campus receding behind me like a stage curtain, I realized that the story would not be neat. Natasha's attempts at change were real enough to be noticed, and fragile enough to shatter. My own choices, whether to stay, to hold her accountable, to witness her attempts, mattered in ways that scared me. I had become a participant in a living experiment. Could curiosity catalyze transformation without romanticizing harm? Could I keep my agency while remaining involved? A week later, an email arrived with the subject line, "Preliminary Report." The administration had compiled testimonies and recommended a formal restorative process. Natasha was to meet with students who had accused her, facilitated by a counselor. The choice to participate publicly, no longer anonymous, no longer private, would be hers to make. The report noted my testimony as relevant. When I texted her about the meeting, her reply was short. "I'll go, but I won't do it alone." Her message was an invitation and a plea. It mapped the future in a way I had come to expect from her, direct, slightly scary, and oddly vulnerable. The work ahead would not be only hers to do. It would ask something of me, too. I set the folded post-it into the spine of Jane Eyre and closed the book. The scar above Natasha's brow felt like an emblem of both danger and truth. She had been the bully. She still had the capacity to wound. And yet, because I had chosen to make myself visible in a way that demanded honesty, something in her had begun to rearrange. Little fissures of gentleness had appeared in habitually closed spaces. She had chosen, imperfectly, to be different. When the bell tower chimed my return, I thought of the words she'd said while her voice trembled with an odd mixture of threat and tenderness. "Try not to make me hate you." I had heard the same line a dozen times now, each utterance embroidered with new meaning. It was a request and a warning, a map and a reckoning. Now it felt less like a threat and more like a pact. Try not to make me hate you, and if I do, you leave. Try not to make me hate you, and if I fail, I accept the consequences. The story was not resolved. It had become something messier and more honest, an ongoing test of power, restraint, and whether a person could be gently guided away from harm by someone who refused to be swept into being collateral. My presence had started to change her, not by magic, but by insistence, by boundaries, and by continuous, uncomfortable witnessing. I closed my suitcase and took the folded post-it from between the pages. The crease had softened even more. I put it in my pocket like a coin I might spend if needed. The winter wind under my coat felt like a blank page. I didn't know where it would go next. I only knew I'd chosen to stay in the story, not as a prop, but as an active author of my own lines. If you want to see how the rest of this unfolds, how accountability shapes a person who once wielded power as spectacle, subscribe and follow along. There's more to come, and this is far from finished. When I returned to campus after break, the world had already started to shift. A small flyer posted on the door of the student center announced the restorative circles. Names were listed. Natasha's name was there in black type, ordinary and impossible at once. My own was not listed as a participant, but the counselor had asked if I would be willing to attend as an observer, and to speak only to what I had witnessed. It felt like a thin, crucial thread. The day of the circle, the room smelled like coffee and fresh paper. Chairs formed a ring, volunteers sat with clipboards, and students arrived with the kinds of nerves that compress into the throat. Natasha walked in last, the weight of her past like a cloak she had to shrug off even as she wore it. She greeted the room with a small nod. Her eyes found mine, and I nodded back. Not as ownership, but as recognition that we were both still learning the grammar of repair. What happened in that circle was not heroic. It was messy and slow. People spoke, some with trembling voices, others with the certainty of those who believe their pain must be catalogued. Natasha listened. She did not interrupt. When she spoke, she chose words that were specific and personal. She apologized to named people. She answered questions without deflecting. There were moments of silence heavy enough to be physical. There were moments of small breakthroughs, a realization, an acceptance, a handshake offered and taken. Afterward, as we stepped out into a sky freckled with light, the counselor approached me. "She still has a long way to go," she said, "but this is a meaningful start." "It has to be more than words," I said. "It has to be continuous." "It will be," the counselor replied. "She seems committed." I thought of the sticky note, the coffee spill, the chemistry bench, the folded photograph in my hand. I thought of my mother's steady voice and my friend's wary counsel. I thought of the ledger, and of the ways small acts of accountability can add up to something that looks, in the distant future, like change. Natasha walked me to the bell tower again, as if that were now some unconscious ritual. She stood under the bell and took my hands in both of hers, a rare vulnerability unadorned by threats. "I'm trying," she said. "Not because you demanded it, but because being watched by someone with taste for honesty is a strange thing. It hurts, and it helps." "That's a complicated kind of kindness," I said. "A complicated kind of change," she echoed. "And I know I have hurt people you care about. I'm not asking for forgiveness now. I'm asking for time." "Time is earned," I said.